There's a month for everything, from celebrating pizza to states, the post office, and more. Did you know that September is National Bourbon Heritage Month?
That's right. Our favorite celebrity historian, Raffi Andonian, fills us in on how the appreciation for bourbon came to be. Take a look. September is National Bourbon Heritage Month. And fun fact, did you know that the month was introduced by a Kentucky politician? It's meant for anyone who appreciates bourbon to celebrate with responsibility and respect. And guess what? We've got celebrity historian Raffi Andonian back with us, who we respect. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate you.
A lot of respect going around.
Yeah, for sure. Which whiskeys get labeled bourbon?
Bourbon, now, contrary to popular belief that we think that it must be made in Kentucky, while it has a lot of history in Kentucky, it does not have to be made in Kentucky. So what makes it bourbon is it must be 51% corn, because whiskey is really a mash of different grains, and bourbon is just a type of whiskey. So once it has that 51% corn, and it's aged in charred oak barrels for 2 years or more, that's when you can get to call it bourbon. Now, there are some other requirements, like certain proof requirements and no additions. You can't add flavoring like other whiskeys.
Sure.
But the main big things is you got to have those two components of the corn and the, the process that we're talking about.
So 51% makes that the most, right? So it has to have the ingredient that's the most. Has to
That's right, the majority or more. And that's what gives it that sweet flavor.
Yeah.
You know, corn has a sweetness to it. That's what gives it that sweet flavor. And the color comes from the aging in those charred oak barrels.
Okay,
nice.
Yeah, interesting.
What about the history of whiskey here in America?
I think whiskey is fascinating history, in part because, of course, it comes here during the colonial period, 17th century or so. But to kind of tie it to some of our founding of our country, George Washington himself was a distiller. In fact, distilling was his most profitable venture. And what I brought here today is whiskey that is actually made at Mount Vernon. You can only get it there at his home. They still make it there today with his process. The reason it's clear is because, unlike our bourbon, which came around later in his era, they did not do that process of coloring the way that we're talking about, or I should say aging, that gives it the color. So this is what he would have sold. He would have sold a clear, unaged. They didn't age whiskey back then. So it tastes a little bit different than what you might expect. I think there's a little bit more harsh bite to it. But what's fascinating also ties to the history of politics, because after the Revolutionary War, you had a lot of debts for the states from the war. So there was this movement led by Alexander Hamilton, you know, from the musicals, who ended up saying we need to have a federal tax to assume the debts. Well, that tax was a whiskey tax. And there were all kinds of protests against it because they thought it was unfair. It wanted cash, or it favored bigger distillers, is what some of these small guys in Western Pennsylvania thought. So they did a rebellion. And I'll just say a couple examples of how crazy this got. They stripped down one of the tax officials in Western Pennsylvania naked and tarred and feather him. For example, another tax official, they went and burned down his house. This is the kind of protest happened. So that's why George Washington showed up after trying for a peace convoy, which failed. He showed up with 10,000 plus troops as a sitting president, as a commander-in-chief, and a Revolutionary War hero from before that. And when he showed up, the rebels kind of went and hid. They're like, all right, we're not messing with Washington. But the significance of that is that it was the first test of the new federal government's authority, because it was trying to test the legitimacy of the tax and the federal government. And George Washington being at the head, not only a distiller himself, but as president, certainly helped set a precedent that this country later followed.
How cool is this George Washington's rye whiskey right there? That is very cool.
That has more rye than corn. Because, again, different process, but they still make it there
whiskey,
today.
It's not bourbon.
Correct.
It is whiskey.
Correct. It's a different form before bourbon was out.
And it also, what you said, wasn't aged in the barrels.
Correct. It's not aged. That's why it's clear. It doesn't get the color of those barrels.
Raffi, thank you once again for today's history lesson. Again, if you appreciate and enjoy bourbon, make sure you do it with responsible and respect.
And get a drink. One bourbon, one scotch, one beer.
Sing it all the way to break. Yes. Thanks for joining us, Raffi. We always appreciate you. Yeah. We got more Good Day NWA coming up right after this.